is part of that. I will talk to you about that.
I'm reclaiming my time. I asked you whether you
an
prepared
Antifa member
a
was
list.
arrested in Minneapolis federal court for
my
cyber
time.
stalking.
Did you
they
have
ask a question
list?
and don't want an answer.
The answer is yes or no.
This hearing took an explosive turn when Mary Gay Scanlon cornered Attorney General Pam Bondi over what she called a secret Justice Department list of Americans labeled as domestic terrorists. Bondi refused to commit to showing Congress the list, sparking accusations of government secrecy, political targeting, and a dangerous abuse of power. Watch how this confrontation quickly spiraled into one of the most intense moments of the hearing.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Actually, I think the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bondi, I'm here. On September 25th, President Trump signed a memorandum known as NSPM 7, purporting to address domestic terrorism. But Americans across the political spectrum were immediately alarmed by the memo's blurring of the line between unlawful conduct and constitutionally protected speech and activity, as well as its call to investigate, prosecute, and dismantle groups that the president and Stephen Miller described without evidence as, quote, an organized campaign of radical left terrorism. Now, counterterrorism experts were further alarmed by the administration's singular focus on left-wing extremism, combined with the sudden deletion from the DOJ website of decades of research and law enforcement analysis, which had concluded that right-wing extremism poses the greatest terrorism threat to Americans. The president's memo broadly and vaguely links violent conduct to ideologies, and it targeted specifically anti-American, anti-Christian, and anti-capitalist beliefs, as well as, quote, hostility to so-called traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, end quote. President Trump has repeatedly and openly, however falsely, tried to brand his political opponents with these sentiments listed in his memo. But as you know, as a lawyer, holding beliefs that the White House disagrees with is not a crime. And the statute defining domestic terrorism requires criminal acts, not just thoughts and ideas. That's why legal experts, nonprofit leaders, religious freedom, and civil rights advocates immediately raised the alarm that the new presidential directive was a politically motivated attack on civil society designed to silence those who disagree with the administration. So, Ms. Bondi, Section 3 of that memo directed you, as Attorney General, to submit to the President and Stephen Miller a list of groups or entities whose members are engaged in acts that meet the definition of domestic terrorism. And then on December 4th, you directed the FBI to work with a variety of law enforcement entities to compile a list of groups and entities engaged in such acts by January 3rd, 2026, and to update that report every 30 days thereafter. So can we assume that you or persons under your direction at the Department of Justice have prepared that list of groups or entities who are designated as domestic terrorist organizations? And I just remind you that's a yes or no question. Did you prepare the list?
I'm not going to answer it yes or no, but what I will say is I know Antifa is part of that. I will talk to you about that.
I'm reclaiming my time. I asked you whether you
an
prepared
Antifa member
a
was
list.
arrested in Minneapolis federal court for
my
cyber
time.
stalking.
Did you
they
have
ask a question
list?
and don't want an answer.
The answer is yes or no.
Time belongs to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Gentlelady can proceed.
Okay. So will you commit to providing this committee with any list of organizations that you have recommended be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
We will comply with the law in all matters.
Will you commit to provide this committee with your list of entities that you recommend be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
I'm not going to commit to anything to you because you won't let me answer questions.
Okay, well then we do understand that your current position is that you have a secret list of people or groups that you are accusing of domestic terrorism, but you won't share it with Congress. And I'd remind you that when the US government designates an entity as a foreign terrorist organization, it must report that to Congress and to the entity, because the government can make a mistake and the entity has the opportunity to contest it. So your position seems to be that if you falsely designate an American or an American organization as a terrorist group, there's nothing they can do about it. I think we get it. You don't want to answer the
No,
questions.
you don't get
that
anything
this
regarding
committee-
public safety.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Thank you for the insult. It's clear you didn't come to Congress prepared to answer questions that the American people have every right to have answered. But if you were to prepared to answer truthfully, here's what we expect the facts to show. The administration is keeping lists of Americans who the White House says are engaged in domestic terrorism. Those lists could include Americans who have not committed any acts of terrorism, but simply disagree with this administration, people like Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And your list may include clergy, elected officials, and members of indivisible groups across the country. And those lists likely don't include Proud Boys or Oath Keepers who were actually convicted. Americans have never tolerated political demagogues who use the government to punish people on an enemies list. It brought down McCarthy, it brought down Nixon, and it will bring down this administration as well.
And you were right.
I yield back.
That's why we're so glad they rescinded the
That's right.
memorandum targeting parents. For goodness sake, as the gentleman from California just pointed out in his 5 minutes.
One of the biggest moments from this Judiciary Committee hearing came when Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon challenged Attorney General Pam Bondi over a question that goes to the heart of government transparency and constitutional rights. Scanlon's focus was President Trump's National Security Presidential Memorandum, known as NSPM 7. She argued that the directive blurred the distinction between violent criminal activity and constitutionally protected political speech. According to Scanlon, legal experts, civil rights organizations, and former national security officials warned that the memo had the Justice Department actually created a list of those organizations? And if such a list existed, why hadn't Congress been allowed to see it? Scanlon repeatedly asked for a simple yes or no answer. Instead of directly answering, Bondi began discussing Antifa and arrests involving individuals she believed demonstrated domestic extremist activity. Before Bondi could continue, Scanlon reclaimed her time, arguing that the Attorney General was avoiding the question rather than answering it. The exchange immediately became more confrontational. Scanlon then pressed Bondi on whether she would commit to providing Congress with any list of organizations that had been recommended for domestic terrorism designation. Bondi refused to make that commitment. Instead, she said only that the department would comply with the law before adding that she was not going to commit to anything because, in her view, she was not being allowed enough time to respond. For Scanlon, that refusal spoke volumes. She argued that if the federal government was compiling lists of organizations accused of domestic terrorism while refusing to share those lists with Congress, it represented a serious transparency problem. She also pointed out an important distinction. When the United States designates a foreign terrorist organization, Congress is notified, legal procedures are followed, and affected parties have opportunities to challenge the designation. Scanlon questioned why Americans should receive fewer protections if their own government labels them as extremists. Her concern was not only about organizations accused of violence. She warned that broad language in the administration's directive could sweep in peaceful advocacy groups, clergy, nonprofit organizations, elected officials, or ordinary Americans whose political views differ from those of the White House. Whether viewers agree with that concern or not, Scanlon argued that transparency is essential whenever government agencies are given authority that could affect constitutional rights. Bondi rejected the criticism. She maintained that the Justice Department's priority is protecting public safety and repeatedly suggested that Democrats were more interested in scoring political points than allowing her to fully explain the department's actions. She also criticized the repeated interruptions, arguing that members were asking questions but refusing to allow complete answers before reclaiming their time. The disagreement highlighted a familiar frustration seen in many congressional hearings. Lawmakers often have only 5 minutes, leading witnesses to complain they are being cut off while members argue witnesses are deliberately running out the clock to avoid difficult questions. But beneath the procedural arguments was a much larger debate. How should the government identify genuine domestic security threats while protecting constitutional freedoms? Can political ideology ever become part of a domestic terrorism investigation without threatening First Amendment rights? And how much transparency should Congress and the public expect when the Justice Department develops policies that could affect Americans exercising their constitutional freedoms? Those questions remained largely unanswered by the end of the exchange. Instead, both sides left the hearing standing firmly behind their own positions. Scanlon insisted that Americans deserve to know whether their government is creating lists that could impact citizens based on ideology or association. Bondi insisted that the Justice Department is acting lawfully and that its first responsibility is protecting the American people from legitimate threats. The hearing ultimately became about far more than one memorandum. It became another chapter in the continuing debate over executive power, civil liberties, government transparency, and the balance between protecting national security and protecting constitutional rights. Now it's your turn. Do you believe Congress deserves access to this information in the name of transparency, or do you believe the Justice Department should keep certain national security decisions confidential? Let us know what you think in the comments below.